So today I'm going to be talking to you about using user tests to grow compassion for your users and for the other people that you're working with. So I've been working as an engineer for the past 10 years, and one thing I noticed is that technologists, especially engineers, but the tech industry in general, is good at a lot of things. We're good at solving complex technical challenges, but we have this tiny little blind spot that doesn't get talked about quite enough, and that's human beings. So while we're always talking about frameworks and new technologies and things we're excited about, which is all great, sometimes we lose sight of why we're doing this in the first place. And the only reason for technology to exist is for the human beings who will use it. So that's going to be what we explore today. So historically, this has been the case with engineers. So back in 1966, a study was done assessing the personalities of engineers. This was a study commissioned by a firm called SDC, which was hired by IBM to work on a lot of early technology, like the SAGE system and things like that. And they found a few interesting things about engineers. Programmers are crazy about puzzles, okay, tend to like research applications, fair, risk-taking, okay, and don't like people. So let's focus on that for a minute. Programmers don't like people. Now, this was the 60s, for sure, and maybe things have changed, but if you look around, things actually haven't changed that much. You often hear engineers talk about how stupid their users are. You see engineers having trouble collaborating with other people on their team. We have a lot of human problems in tech, and I think it stems from this issue right here. Now, granted, not every programmer is like this, and I think things are changing, but it's definitely been historically the case. So one of the big consequences of this is that customers suffer. So the previous talk was talking about forms, and she mentioned examples of poorly implemented forms and how frustrating it is to use those sites. That's a great example. So customers suffer in ways like that, where they're confused by the interfaces and frustrated. But there's something deeper here. Well, this book, The Inmates Are Running the Asylum, talks about the bigger problem here, which is that the inmates in this context is us, the engineers, and how this came out in 2005 by Alan Cooper, and it's all about how engineers think differently from normal people. The air quotes are easier to do without all this stuff, but, and normal people don't like the interfaces we build, basically. And he proposed that interaction design should be its own field, and the people that we need to have roles in companies that do that. So a lot of that's already come true, which is great. But there's a deeper issue here. This is from an animation by Steve Cutts from a music video by Moby, and it kind of illustrates another issue with tech, which is that we don't always think about the unintended consequences of the products we build. So here's a stream of people staring at their phones, falling to their probable death in a sewer grate. And although this is an exaggeration, it's actually not that much of an exaggeration, because if you look around San Francisco, but most cities, most popular cities in the country or the world, people are kind of buried in their phones, and there's issues of addiction here and distraction and a lack of connection with other people. This has come out in the news lately. This is an article by Om Malik, Silicon Valley has an empathy vacuum. It's actually, his issue focuses on the deeper issues, which are like Facebook showing parents pictures of their dead children because they didn't think about that, because the young guys, mostly guys originally, who were implementing the system at Facebook, they never had a child die, so they didn't think to worry about that. He also talks about the fake news issue that's been very popular in the news lately. Similarly, Anil Dash did an interview recently on tech's moral reckoning. And this is all about some of the human issues that are ignored in tech, including the fake news stuff, exploiting people's vulnerabilities using tech, taking advantage of addictions and things like that. He also links it to the diversity and inclusion issue, because that's another human issue, and it's all related, because when you don't have compassion for people, it affects every part of your business. So this is kind of a bleak situation that I've portrayed here, but it's not all depressing. I think we can do better. So can we do better? I believe so. I think we're already starting to. We all probably got into tech because we love what it can do. So it can make people more productive. You can tell that she is productive because she's smiling. And it makes us creative. You can tell he's creative because he has a beard and glasses. And it is educational. No comment on this because it's just cute kids. It can be educational, and it can help connect us. I assume they're looking at a picture of, or maybe a face chat or something, I don't know. But it can help connect us to other people. So tech can have like a lot of positive impact on our lives. So the question is, how do we bridge that gap between where we are with not caring about people and where we could be, which is like this wonderful world where all interfaces are great and they're not taking advantage of people, and we're really solving the world's hard problems. And I think we do that through compassion. So what I mean by compassion is not really so much maybe what you may have heard of in religions or anything like that. What I mean by compassion is actually an optimization problem, which is optimizing for minimizing suffering across the board for everybody involved. And that's what compassion means to me. So it's really just like admitting that human beings matter more than machines. So to portray it a bit more, Monica Worline is a researcher in compassion, and she has a book out, Awakening Compassion at Work. And this is from an interview she did. And she said, you may never have used the word compassion, but when you're identifying somebody's pain point and you're trying to create something that alleviates it, that's actually compassionate product design. So that's really what we're going to be exploring today. And you know, I thought, well, what's the leanest way to start getting engineers to care more about users? And I think the best way is through user tests. It's just a simple way to do it. We're going to talk about a very easy to implement solution with user tests today. So we're not going to get too complicated. And I think that this will be a path to building compassion for your users. So the plan for the rest of this talk, we're going to talk about what are user tests, just kind of briefly, so that you know what I'm talking about when I mention them throughout the talk, why you should care, because that's important. The bulk of the talk will actually focus on that, I think, and how you can participate. And that part is actually not even that long, because it's actually not that difficult to get started. So who am I to be talking about this? I'm just an engineer. I'm not a designer. I'm not a UX researcher. I'm not even a front-end developer. I'm more of a full-stack developer with an emphasis on the back end, if anything. But I started participating in user tests more deeply over the past few years, and it's drastically changed my approach to software development, and so I want to share it with as many people as possible. This is me in the debrief of my first user test. A lot of the purple ones are mine because I'm kind of an excessive note taker, but yeah, more on that later. So what are user tests? I'm just going to give you a brief overview because there's a lot to it, but I just kind of want to get us all on the same page. So user tests are often part of a grander scheme called human-centered design. They can be done separate from that, but they're kind of built into that. So human-centered design is all about building a deep empathy with the people you're designing for. So user tests are going to be an element of that. Human-centered design actually has an ISO standard, and this is an excerpt from that. This approach enhances effectiveness and efficiency, improves human well-being, and counteracts possible adverse effects of use on human health. So this gets into some of the deeper issues we were talking about with addiction and psychological impact on people. So a user test will basically be a study of a user in a context using tools to perform tasks to achieve a goal. That's a basic way to look at it with some terminology there. So it might look something like this, where the woman's working on a product, she's like using it. The facilitator is observing and taking notes potentially. There's some variations on that, but that's just to have something in your head as we go further through this talk. So why should you care? We're all very busy. We don't have like tons of extra time to just watch users do things, right? So I want to focus on why you should really care about this stuff. So one, you can build compassion for users. So let's get into that a bit deeper. So I don't know if you all are familiar with Nick Burns, your company's computer guy from SNL, but basically he is an IT professional, not necessarily an engineer, but he goes around helping his coworkers, and he's very frustrated with how dumb they are compared to him, right? So in this sketch, like Chris Kattan had done something about like, oh, the stupid email, and he's like, it's the email that's stupid, not you, right? In a really sarcastic way. So this is a caricature of highly technically experienced people. However, I don't think it's that far from the truth. And I say that being an engineer myself, and I'm guilty of this sometimes. So these are some GitHub commits. I spent only like 5 minutes searching GitHub commits and found all of these examples. Clarification for stupid users. Being smarter for the stupid user. Do default value for stupid users. Add README comment for idiot user in the classroom. Like, basically, the way we talk about users is often not very kind. And the reason there's a problem with this If we blame the customer for being stupid, we're putting blame in the wrong place. We're not being empathetic at all. We are the problem. We design the product or service. Another quote from Monica Werlein. And I think it's a really good point because, again, like I said, the whole reason for technology is to make people's lives easier in some way, right? So if we're calling people stupid, we're doing something wrong. It's not them. So I don't think engineers are bad people. I'm an engineer, maybe that's why. But I think it's partly an issue of this bubble that we live in. And I don't mean the startup bubble. What I mean is the bubble of our peers. So all of us here, likely have a certain level of technical knowledge, and so we often surround ourselves with people with similar expertise. And so we get to think that anybody who doesn't have that just lacks basic skills, and so we view them as somehow beneath us or something like that. And I don't think so. I think the way to fix this is just to get outside of that bubble. So from that book that I mentioned earlier, The Inmates Are Running the Asylum, Alan Cooper has this great quote. I took out part of it because he used a microaggression against people with mental health issues. But the most valuable contribution of usability testing is made when programmers are forced to view typical users struggling with their programs. The programmers are shocked and incredulous, and he goes on to say, usability testing is a useful whack on the side of the head for recalcitrant software engineers, showing them that there is indeed a problem. So if you've been using your app over and over again, or your website, or whatever it may be, you're probably used to a lot of the quirks in it, and you think it's easy to use because you've used it thousands and thousands of times as you've been building it. However, for new people, it might actually be really hard to use. And so user tests are a good way to alert you to things like that. And when you see somebody in person, this is where the compassion comes from, because you can actually pick up on their feelings. You see what confuses them, you see what they're struggling with. So if you're thinking this is not part of your job, you're an engineer, we have designers, you don't need to worry about that. I just want to mention this quote from the Agile Manifesto. So this is from the principles of the Agile Manifesto. I hope you all are doing some degree of Agile, whether or not fully, but if any of you are doing waterfall, I'm sorry. I hope this talk still applies, but I really don't know. But this is from the Agile Manifesto, and they say, our highest priority is to satisfy the customer through early and continuous delivery of valuable software. And valuable means valuable to the customer. So it really is part of your job to care about this stuff. Okay, so one reason, build compassion for users. Next reason, communicate with designers. So developers and designers don't have the best reputation for getting along great. There's often a lot of conflict. Sometimes it seems like designers are just trying to make our life difficult by telling us to change pixels here and there and change this color over and over again. It can often seem like that. But if you start participating in user tests, you may just find that there's a method to their madness, which is that when they ask you to make a change, there's usually a very good reason. So a very simple example is I was observing a user test, and we had a headshot of a person, a picture of a person's face in a circle. And consistently, all of the people in the user test kept pressing the person's face. And it wasn't a button, but they kept pressing it. Why are they doing this? And it's because all of the other buttons in our app were circles. So they assumed everything that was a circle was a button. So the designer, asked us to change the shape or whatever, or move it, or make it look different in some way. And if they had just asked that without that context, I'd be like, why do you want it a square now? You just said it was a circle. Why does it really matter? It's just a picture, right? But I kind of understood that. And so you can't participate in every user test, but once you see a few examples of how designers go through this process, designers and UX researchers and whoever is involved in that, you'll have a little bit more respect for what they do, I think, and appreciation and understanding. So then your designer-dev relationship can be a lot better, and you can collaborate together in harmony and really work to build better products. And to think about it from the designer's perspective, you know how it's really great when a designer knows a little bit of CSS or HTML and you can kind of talk on that level, for example, or a little bit of iOS, whatever it is. It's kind of like that for them. If you know a little bit about user concerns and that kind of stuff, it can, and some of the vocabulary, it can really make a difference to your working relationship. Also, it's just more efficient. So this is from a book called UX for Lean Startups by Laura Klein. She says, by including developers, designers, and product owners in the majority of decisions, it makes the entire design process faster and easier to change. So there's a benefit to you as a developer having the skills from observing user tests in order to participate in these discussions. So final reason is kind of a big one. Find more meaning in your work. So when I started off as an engineer, and even now, one of my biggest fears is becoming a code monkey, where my worst job ever would be somebody telling me exactly what to code, and I just had to code it, and I had no input and could give no feedback. That would be a nightmare for me. Now, I don't know if some of you enjoy doing that. Maybe there are people, but I certainly don't. So the idea that instead, by watching user tests and participating in that process, I can bring a lot more to the table in terms of shaping the product and giving my feedback as a developer. Because there are going to be times when I know things, new technology perhaps, that the designer doesn't know yet. So we may see something happen in a user test, somebody struggle with something, and I'll be able to propose a solution that the designer may not be familiar with yet. And this can just bring a lot more fulfillment to your work because you see that you're not just putting pixels on a screen, you're not just writing text in a text editor that compiles and then produces something. Like, you're really building technology that's helping people improve their lives in some way. So, and the reason this is important, if it's not self-evident, actively participating in work that links purpose, meaning, and passion to advance the greater good is deeply satisfying. And this is from a book by Sean Murphy called The Optimistic Workplace. I highly recommend it because optimistic is not about being all shiny and happy all the time. It's more about believing that the hard work you do pays off. And it's a really great book. Highly recommend it. So we've looked at how user tests can build compassion, help you communicate with your designers, and it will help you find more meaning in your work. So I want to dive into a few examples to show that I'm not just making all of this up. So I was working on an app for parents to answer some questions and find out their child's risk for autism. Very serious app, right? It's kind of a big deal to tell somebody that their kid has this certain likelihood for autism. So we did extensive user testing, and we brought in a user, and we told her, which I'll talk about later about how you start off a user test, but we told her this is not a test of you, and this is just a simulation, so don't take the results seriously about your child. You can even answer fake questions, with fake answers if you want to, just to soften it. However, when she got to the end, based on her answers, she saw something that looked like this. This was not the actual interface, because I sketched this up and I am not a designer, but it looked something like this. And basically your risk was displayed from low to high. And then it showed where your child, Kimmy, here is on the scale, and she's in this nice, friendly-looking red area here, and it was actually red. And in the user test that I was watching, the user actually used the phrase danger zone. She said, oh, my daughter's in the danger zone, which is just a horrible thing to hear. And so I saw the emotion in her face when she said this, even though we told her it's not real results, but she was just so hurt. And I don't have kids, so it's not that I could ever imagine that. It's just that watching somebody else go through it, you really build that compassion. So how did that affect my work after that? Every time there was language that we implemented or color choice, I championed that we be I insisted that we be very gentle with that and careful and to avoid anything scary in the app because we need to be mindful of how it really affects people. Another story, I was waiting in the airport in LAX for my flight to leave, and this guy started talking to me, and we were talking about why we're in town. I was in town for a wedding. He was in town for his aunt's funeral, which was really sad. And he whips out his phone, which is one of those brick Android phones. I don't even know what model it was, but a very old phone that I had not seen in years. And he wanted to show me a picture of his dead aunt. And it was a very sweet thing, right? He wanted to show me, a very human moment. So he spent 10 minutes scrolling through his picture. First, he couldn't find where you even see the photos on this ancient interface he was using. And then he finally did, and he found the photo after 10 minutes of struggling with this. And then he showed me, and I was like, oh, that's wonderful. And then he starts to tell me a story about her, just holding his phone in his hand. The phone goes to sleep. Then he sees it go to sleep. He presses some button to open it, and then it disappears, and then he has to go through the same process again of trying to find it. Now, you may think, oh, this guy sounds like an idiot, but he is not an idiot. He is a normal person who is just trying to wrestle with this technology we've built that doesn't always make sense. And all he was trying to do was show me a picture of his dead aunt, and he had emotional issues going on because of that. There was a language barrier because his phone is in English, and English wasn't his first language. And this was just such a moment where it was even if you're building a photo app and not a healthcare app about autism or whatever, you still have to consider that there are real emotions here because you don't know what context that person's using the photo app in. So that wasn't a technical user test, but it was definitely kind of a guerrilla user test of a product I didn't build that shows how, the impact we can have on people. So something that might be more interesting to you all, or more specific anyway, is even user tests can even inform what kind of frameworks you use sometimes. So we did a user test, and the user was going from question to question, answering these questions, and the page was refreshing each time, and it was slow. and they expressed frustration in the user test. So that's why we decided to go to Angular. This was like years ago, so it was an older version and everything. But we decided to go with a single-page app because that would give a better user experience in that context. So it can directly inform which frameworks you decide to use and which technologies. You may think, well, I'm working on internal tools or something like that, so I really don't need to worry about all this. Although I guess if that's true, maybe you wouldn't have come to this talk, but let's just say that you might think that. I was working on an internal tool one time, and it had a drop-down. And in the early days of the company, this drop-down had like 5 choices. And so it was fine, it was a drop-down, and then you pick the choice. However, the company had grown massively from like, a few hundred users to like millions of users. And so this drop-down, which was of some kind of grouping, had grown to thousands and thousands of options. So it was just horrendous to scroll through this. However, the people using it inside the company didn't speak up because they just thought that was part of their job, is just to like scroll through this, go through this long drop down or whatever to like try to find what they were looking for. And then during a user test, internal user test, I was observing them do their work, and I saw that they did that and like how long it took them, and I was like, are you kidding me? Why are they doing this? And so it was so easy to just add an autocomplete so that they could just start typing and then bam, right? It's like so simple. But was that on our backlog? No. What was on our backlog was completely throwing out the whole admin framework and rebuilding it and upgrading and all this stuff. It's like, okay, maybe we do need to do that at some point, but we have this easy win where we can save people hours of time, like a week, just by changing this one little piece. And so that all came from user tests. So user tests can also help you prioritize what's really important. Okay, so hopefully you're convinced of why you should at least be somewhat interested in user tests. So let's talk a little bit about how. So in the simplest terms, you bring somebody into your office, you make them use your product, and you watch them doing it. So I think that in person is best, although you can do it via video. I even worked for a company that did that, so there's definitely benefit in doing it via video. But there's something, and you can even do it over the phone sometimes, but really the best way is to observe people in person. And the reason for that, here's a quote from Gloria Steinem, and this quote is hot off the presses from earlier this week when she was speaking at another conference I was at. She started her talk by saying, to be together with all 5 senses is irreplaceable. And it's true. And she was speaking to a group of technologists, and she said, I know we all love technology, but there's something about connecting in person and being able to pick up on subtle cues in people's body language and their language and the words that they use to talk about their experiences. So we'll run through how to do a basic user test, and then I'll talk about what would be the best way for you to get started as a developer in this. So one is you start off by asking them easy background questions. So you might ask them about questions related to your app. Like if you're building a food app, you might ask them so tell me about how you pick your meals for the week or things like that. You might say, oh, tell me about where you're from, how many, do you have kids, things like that. Basically small talk, because while you may find that trivial and boring, it actually helps make them feel more comfortable and puts them at ease, which is important to get their best feedback. You explain that this is not a test of them, but rather of the product. I mentioned that earlier when I mentioned user test, and that I did. And that's really important because you don't want people trying to prove to you how smart they are. So then you ask them to speak their thoughts out loud as they use the product. And then you ask them to perform certain tasks, like in your app or your website or whatever it may be. Then you watch and record observations, quotes, and interpretations on sticky notes, 1 per note. So it's kind of this cool thing where you have anybody observing in the user test has a stack of sticky notes. It's a really good way to do it. And you color code by the user. So then people just kind of rapid fire write down these things, these observations, quotes, and interpretations. The reason there's a star by interpretations is that you want to be careful with this because your interpretation of something that happens may be very different from somebody else's interpretation. So you should at least note that it's an interpretation. I really like quotes, like I mentioned the danger zone quote, because it's so powerful and it gives so much information when you're relaying this information to other people because you can't mistake what danger zone means. It's kind of obvious. Yeah. Okay, and then you debrief. So these 2 here, watching and recording observations, quotes, and interpretations, and debriefing. I think this is the best way for developers to get in on the action. because all of this other stuff takes a lot of practice, and given the whole not liking people thing, this maybe is not our strong suit, but at least many of us. Whereas this, observing, I feel like engineers do pay attention to detail quite a bit. And so I actually love doing this. When I first did my user test, it wasn't like, oh, somebody's making me do a user test. It was like, oh my God. When I did it, it was just so fun because you see things, you just do one and you'll see what I'm talking about. Because no matter how familiar you are with your app, when you see a person using it and you're paying laser focused attention, you'll see amazing things happen. So let's talk about the debrief a bit. So here's an actual debrief that I participated in. On this left side, what you have that's not pictured is profiles of the users. So all of the purple ones, memorize that I was one of the purple participants, so I record it way too much. But you put the person's name, and you might put a picture of them if you have it, and information. So in our case, we had information about their kids and that kind of stuff. And then this is another person in pink, and this is another person yellow. And across the top are different areas of our app. So we had the sign in, take a video, upload a video, create a profile, and then you're getting your score. And so then everybody who participated observed the user test, which you shouldn't have too many observers. So there's one facilitator, and then you can have multiple observers. I think sometimes we had up to 3. That's kind of a lot. It's intimidating for a user to have that many people in the room. It's not really a best practice. It's best if you have one facilitator. And if you have a fancy office where you have like a two-way mirror type thing, then that would be especially great to use, but not everybody has that. And I'm a firm believer in using what you got to get something done rather than nothing. So you cluster things that are related. So some of these stacks are all related to, and I think somewhere around here is the actual danger zone quote that I mentioned. But anyway, so this is what a debrief looks like. And then as you do this, one person who is observing walks the whole team through the story from start to finish in terms of the user did this and then they did this, just to kind of give an overview. Because the people who participate in this user test might not be the same people who participate in this user test, because you can't participate in all of them, right? That wouldn't be efficient. So it's good to share these stories and combine them. In terms of how many you should do, well, there's some studies show that you can find out most usability issues with 5 users. So 5 is a good number. So I want to talk about some pitfalls that I've seen and heard of, and just give you a heads up so you can avoid it. One is overgeneralizing from one user. So if one user thinks something is terrible, you may think, okay, we got to change it. But don't jump the gun on that, because one user is just that, one user. That's why 5 users is better, like I said, but even that, you also want to apply common sense, because common sense and your designer who has some expertise in this area. Another pitfall is letting user feedback too directly dictate designs. So I actually left a company because I was kind of annoyed with their approach to this, which was we had visited a customer and asked them about our dashboard that we built for them. And the customer said, I always miss my notifications. So could you just put in thick, big red text at the top, you have 5 notifications, really big, so I won't miss it. And I was just, which is funny because it's users will say stuff and that's useful. But the CEO was actually talking about maybe doing something like that. And I was like, no, that's not how design works. So don't do that. Users will give you suggestions, but what you should really focus on is the problem. And then allow your designer, if you don't have a designer, allow your team, because you're all designers then, focus on the solutions, but after the debrief and everything, but don't let the user dictate your solutions. So another one is letting feedback hurt your ego. So some engineers, some human beings, most human beings, are easily offended if people criticize their work, right? So you're having somebody use your app, pick it apart, and it's very possible that they will say, oh, well, that's dumb, or whatever. I mean, most users are pretty nice, but they could give you pretty bad feedback. And even if it's not that bad, they're going to give you some kind of feedback. So don't let it hurt your ego. This is not about you. This is about them. So a reminder of that, this is from a book on interviewing as qualitative research for social sciences. But it's very relevant here, which is that interviewing requires that we interviewers keep our egos in check. It requires that we realize we are not the center of the world. At the heart of interviewing research is an interest in other individuals' stories because they are of worth. I think that's really important to remember, and it's about interviewing, but user testing is a form of interviewing, and it starts off with just asking questions to the user, so that's just something to keep in mind. So another problem, and if you're not asking questions, you don't have to worry about this, but it's asking leading questions. So if you say stuff like, wouldn't it be better if, and you propose whatever it is you want to implement, that's not really fair. You're biasing the user. If you say, what's confusing about this page? That seems like it might be a useful question to ask, but the problem there is you're assuming that there is something confusing, and you're priming the user to think there's something confusing, and there might not be anything confusing. And if you ask them that, they'll be forced to find something, even if there's nothing. So don't do that either. And then finally, this one's not really a pitfall, but it is something that can happen. I told you I loved it. I didn't end up doing this, becoming a UX researcher, but if you spend a lot of time on it, to the neglect of your coding and everything, maybe you just want to become a UX researcher or designer. But I'm telling you, you probably will enjoy it, because if you do it in the simple way I'm talking about, it can be a lot of fun. So to summarize some of the benefits, user testing helps you empathize with users to build more useful products, helps you collaborate more effectively with designers, and helps you find more meaning in your work. To summarize the process, you watch and listen, you record, you analyze, implement, and repeat. Because the whole point is you do the debrief, analyze stuff, and then create a new iteration of the product, and then repeat the whole process. And that is the whole idea of iterative design and development. So hopefully I've convinced you to at least try it. I recommend just experimenting with it, because what do you have to lose? Like, you can do it all in about an hour, so use an hour. Bring in a user, see what happens. If you really hate it, no one's going to make you do more. But I think you won't hate it, because I think you'll be like, wow, I either really helped this person, or wow, my product is doing really harmful things in the world, and which either one is a very helpful thing to see. Because I think as technologists, it's our responsibility to make the world a better place, to use technology for good. Like these happy people here who are using the computer to connect, and this would have been impossible, even 10 years ago. This sort of thing. And so, there's a lot of potential for really wonderful things to come out of technology. I want to mention a quote by Anil Dash, who said, "Remaking the tech industry, reforming it around being more ethical and humane, this is one of the most important missions around." And what I'm talking about, user tests, may seem like a small piece of that, but we have to start caring about users in a small way in order to care about them in this big way that he's talking about. And then just a food for thought, Tristan Harris, who used to work in design at Google, has proposed a Hippocratic oath for software designers, and I think it could be extended to developers as well, which would stop the exploitation of people's psychological vulnerabilities. And that means not creating addictive products that act like slot machines to take advantage of people. And my final quote is from Karen Armstrong, from one of my favorite books, 12 Steps to a Compassionate Life, highly recommended. "If it is not tempered by compassion and empathy, reason can lead men and women into a moral void." As engineers, we have the reason part down. We kind of have to, because that's our job. But a lot of times we miss out on these other parts, and that's where we end up where we are with technology right now. It's kind of a moral void with a few small exceptions. So here's my website, here's my email address. If you have any trouble implementing this at your company, or you have any questions, or you want to check out these emotional intelligence workshops that were mentioned in my intro, then here's the place to do it. I'm also on Twitter, so we can just talk via Twitter too. So that's it, thank you.
Are there any questions? Yes? No? Maybe I have some questions for you then?
Oh, there's one.
You got one? There we go.
But I'll take yours too, later. No, you first.
So how do you implement a system where you can have a tighter feedback loop with users, where it's an efficient process and all the developers are involved, but not necessarily that? It's kind of like, how do I get more feedback on the next sprint and the next sprint and the next sprint to make it that I can iterate and improve the product faster?
So are you working alone or part of a team?
Big team.
Do you have the designers and things like that
Big
to help?
team, user research team,
Okay.
design team, development team.
Okay, cool. Yeah, so I think that, a lot of times what I've done is I've been in situations where the UX designer and the researchers would be a few steps ahead of where the developers were in terms of implementation. I mean, not that many steps ahead, right? But kind of at least one kind of cycle ahead. And so then engineers could sit in on tests of future features that are not yet ready to implement, but they could still sit in on those tests because it's kind of like you switch your mindset to, okay, now I'm looking at these forward-looking features, and that's what I'm observing, versus what I'm coding day to day. You can still, participate in those. But in terms of tighter feedback loop, I mean, video is an option too, because it's one thing that is, if you've never done user tests, maybe the hardest part is recruiting people and getting them to actually show up in your office. A lot of times we'd go on Craigslist to get people, and they'd say, yeah, I'll be there. They'd confirm in the morning, and they just would never show. And so that's a big issue. So you can avoid that if you go the video route. There's a few different options there that you can check out online, but that people will use your app, and it will record the screen, and sometimes it'll even record their face. So, because you want to see their expressions and everything too. But even if you just hear them talk out loud, so usertesting.com is one of them that does that. And then you can have a little bit tighter loop because you don't have to wait for the recruiting process. And you don't have to, you mentioned about having all developers involved. You don't have to have all developers involved. I would say one developer, each developer should participate in some number of user tests. Yeah, okay. Just to be clear on that. I'm not saying every developer needs to be in every user test or any form of that.
Are there any other questions? It's not TV. We're real people. Any questions? No? Okay. I have one question for you before we break. So, I think all of us in the room can tell that you're very passionate about this, and that it's something that you've unlocked for yourself and you want to share with the world. I'm curious to know what some of the roadblocks or objections you've come up against, maybe in your peers or in the teams you've worked with, and how you've overcome some of those. Obviously, you see the benefits and you talk about them passionately, but no doubt there are some people who just they're not there yet. And what's some of the ways that you've been able to work with teams who maybe aren't, ready to do this, and you're trying to sort of convince them to try?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, so this fits in pretty well with human-centered design. So most companies who are open to the human-centered design approach are understanding of this sort of thing. But some companies are not even at that point. They're kind of back in, we just don't have time for this. We just need to implement this and see what happens. So I think the easiest way to get people on board with this is an example, quick example. So there's the whole idea of the design sprint that some of the other talks have mentioned, and that only takes a week. So if you can get a company to agree to a small scale week where you put this at the heart of what you do, and you do the user tests, you do the prototype, you do the user test, and then you show them how, because the evidence is in the result of doing this. So I think if you can get them to even just do a little experiment, and that's why I suggest you to all experiment, because maybe some of you are hesitant. But if you do a tiny little experiment, so your next feature, try this out. So that's what I do with those companies. Is I suggest that they try it with the next feature. So try it with one. If they don't like it, then then we don't do it. The other kind of thing that's come up is just I chose very intentionally to use the word compassion, and I knew it would alienate some people because it's considered soft and touchy-feely. So I have gotten some feedback about that. However, once I explain it from my position of it being an optimization problem of minimizing suffering, in order to build better products and affect the bottom line, so you will have a more successful product. Usually I can convince them to at least try it. But the other thing is, I'm kind of the mindset of, not everybody is going to agree with what you're doing, and not everybody is going to buy what you're selling, so to speak. And I've kind of made peace with that as well.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.